it's not like a normal job. As I always told people in journalism, when you get into news, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job. And suddenly the 500 friends and family turn into 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. And suddenly I've discovered
500,000.
It's not just the media, right? The lack of trust is there when it comes to the government, the FDA, the CDC, the FBI, the CIA. You're not rewarded for truth. You're rewarded for extreme ideology.
You don't have to be true anymore. It's clickbait. We're looking for headlines to get clicks and attention.
Welcome to XTRAordinary, the most extraordinary podcast in the world. Today we have Mosh. I know you by one name. I actually don't even know your first name.
It's like Madonna or Bono, bro.
Oh, Cher.
I mean,
throw that in there.
Cher, yes.
Or Teague.
Mosheh.
Yep.
Spence.
Spence.
Yep.
Mosh Oinounou.
Being a one-name person is pretty extraordinary.
It is, speaking of extraordinary.
Kobe, LeBron.
I
Mosh.
think Mosh.
Mosh.
Part of the reason is that my last name has 6 vowels in it, so it becomes a little complicated for folks to pronounce.
Yeah.
The last name is Oinounou, but it's spelled Oinounou. My dad's from Morocco, so
let's go with Mosh.
For simplicity purposes, we've gone with Mosh.
Yeah, I like that.
And I tried to simplify it further with my brand, Mo News.
Yeah.
Like we're no room for error.
You're the anchor of Mo News, which is also extraordinary, what you've done with that.
Thank you.
Pretty cool stuff.
It's sort of well, backing up, I've always been very into news. And then after like 15 years in like working in network news at Fox and CBS and Bloomberg, I was like, enough. I can't do the day-to-day. It's a grind, up at 3 a.m, and you are wedded to world events. Like, it's not like a normal job. As I always told people in journalism, when you get into news, it's a lifestyle. It's not a job.
Yeah.
So that was taking a break. COVID hits, and friends and family are like, what's going on? Like, Mosh, I depend on you for news. It was the first time I wasn't in a newsroom. And suddenly I find myself falling back into like, okay, this is what Fauci had to say today. This is what, Trump is saying. This is what I'm reading in Italian newspapers. And started doing that on Instagram for friends and family.
You get to work from home in your boxers.
I mean, I put on sweatpants.
Okay.
But technically, yes, I could.
Yeah.
And so that was the amazing thing. So it's like, we're all locked in our houses, like first few weeks, et cetera. I'm doing this for friends and family, and then I'll figure out my next job. And suddenly the 500 friends and family turn into 1,000, 5,000, 10,000. And suddenly I've discovered
500,000.
You're back into news.
We're at 500,000.
You're finally back into news.
500,000.
Go.
I'm back into news.
Yeah.
I now have 500,000 people, like new friends that I've never met before.
Yeah.
Celebs have started following me, and this was like a turning point. Summer 2020, like, all right, I did this Instagram thing for a few months, all well and good. I have to go back to the, mainstream media. I have to go figure out my next job. But the job found me. And now suddenly Joe Jonas is promoting me and Nick Jonas is promoting me. And I'm like hearing from all these celebs. I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
We've touched on something. We have found an opportunity in the marketplace. And so this is the job. This is not the thing before the thing. This is the thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. When did you realize that it turned into the thing?
So credit to my wife, who then my girlfriend, who was like, this is a thing. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
Like, come on. And so she very early on was like, this is gonna be your thing. I was skeptical. I think it was we did COVID, and then I was like, all right, I covered COVID, like we're gonna move back to the real world. And then Black Lives Matter and those protests start to heat up summer 2020, other events start to happen, and now I'm covering event after event. I'm covering all news. And I'm hearing from people around the world who are like, we depend on you and we appreciate you. And here's like a photo I took here, and here's the reaction
lot of
I'm getting
people
here.
get their news from Mo News.
And it's incredible because they're already on Instagram. And so they found like, what's really convenient, staying on Instagram and also getting my news fix.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And many mainstream media outlets never really took Instagram seriously, partially because of monetization, partially just because of resources, partially because why?
And because they're also like somewhat biased. I find that your news is very unbiased, like
just facts.
Yeah.
I try to cut through it. I think I found that in particular. Well, that was always what I tried to do when I worked at the previous organizations. And I found that like that's just my knee jerk. I was like, let me give you all the perspectives. Like, it's not my job to tell you what to think. And I think you found media outlets doing that with COVID. You found media outlets doing that with Trump and politics. And I think that there's a huge audience of people on Instagram and frankly on all platforms who are like, don't tell me what to think. Tell me what's going on and I want to make a decision.
Yeah.
I think
on how I
instinctively
feel.
as well as an individual being your source, it's a little more trustworthy than a corporation. Like there's
so
just
true.
such an agenda with any news that I've seen. It's like, okay, pretty obvious. But
Yeah.
as an individual, you're able to build that trust with your community, and they're trusting because of it, you know?
Yeah, and I think that like that took
Yeah.
us a while to realize in the news industry, and I don't even think everyone's realized it. But we spent years in news taking the personalities out of it, being like, it's the brand, it's the
Yeah,
brand,
yeah.
it's the logo. And you have found now across, it's not just the media, right? The lack of trust is there when it comes to the government, the FDA, the CDC, the FBI, the CIA.
Everything.
Go across
Yeah.
the Supreme
Every
Court.
single
Trust
thing.
Like
yeah.
every single entity out there, they're like, what's your agenda?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, I think it's important to recognize a couple things. One, we all have biases, right? We are who we are, like where we're from, where we live, where we went to college,
Your experiences.
our genders.
Yeah.
Like we have biases built in. How well can you take those biases out, or try to really open yourself up to multiple perspectives? And I think that's something that is several folks in the mainstream media have forgotten. And I think part of the issue is that the biases don't just lie in politics. The biases lie in backgrounds, in a sort of elitist bias.
We're
right?
also living in a system where it's like just being first is rewarded. You don't have to be true anymore. It's clickbait. We're looking for headlines to get clicks and attention.
That's part of the problem with these platforms is you're not rewarded for truth. You're not rewarded. You're rewarded for extreme ideology, right? Because you're rewarded by the comments and the engagement.
Exactly.
So you say something incendiary, even if you don't completely believe it, you're going to suddenly rise to the top of the TikTok or Instagram algorithm because there's going to be a whole bunch of people who agree with you and people who disagree with you. But you won the day. And you won a
it's
bunch
just
of followers
radical
for saying something
and
controversial.
somewhat divisive. Let's talk about background for a second. You're going to Israel tomorrow. You are
First time.
Jewish. I'm Jewish.
Yeah,
And you were just in Israel.
correct.
You were telling us this story when we started, and then I kind of cut you off to start the show, but about how to determine if you're. I think you said you're 1% Jewish.
Yeah, I'm.
What was the
so I got my-
story that you were?
I got my DNA test back, and it says I'm 1.1% Jewish and 1% Arab.
Yeah.
So
Well, you can make peace in the Middle East, my friend.
I gotta go out there. I gotta handle some stuff.
I think there's a Nobel Peace Prize on
Yeah.
the horizon.
Yeah, in my DNA, it's gonna unlock.
Hey,
that
listen,
piece.
some people have won Nobel Peace Prizes for much less than what he's about to do. So, I think that, we were going to the religious context of it. And I think it's like
Yeah.
important, like, all right, so we got, 8 billion people in the world. You have about 2 billion Muslims, about 2 billion Christians, just under 1 billion Hindus, Buddhists, etc. Down the row, there's about 14 million Jews in the world.
Yeah.
Self-described Jews.
Wow.
I'd
Very
say 14
small
million with
percentage,
an M.
yeah.
Very small. Part of the reason is the Jews don't proselytize. It's very actually hard to convert to Judaism. You have to go through a whole process. But what's unique about Jews, right, is that it's not just a religion, but it's an ethnicity, as in you can do
both.
blood tests
Yeah.
and like find a certain percentage, right? And so what we were talking about earlier is that in determining your faith, different religions have different perspectives on this. Through Islam, it's through the father. Through Judaism, it's the mother. But that wasn't always the case. If you go back 1,000 years, Judaism was also a patrilineal religion through the father. At some point, there's a conversation that happens among Jewish leaders 1,000 years ago. I think it's in Spain at the time, and they're like, "Well, this is pre-DNA. Like, we can't actually figure out who the father is,
Yeah.
but we definitely know who the mother is.
Right.
We should become matrilineal." So the flip happens in Judaism about 1,000 years ago, where Judaism is passed down through the mother.
Ironically, it makes a lot of sense.
True.
Yeah.
The Jews are pretty logical people. I know who your mom is.
Yeah, Maury's never. There's never been a Maury show where it's, you are the mother.
Yeah.
Right.
It's like, well, we kind of knew that. So
But I wish you luck on your trip there. I was there in February. Obviously it is.
When it was very dangerous, I assume.
Well, I have to say this. So, it's very interesting. I'll get notes from people being like, do you walk outside in New York? You take the subway? I'm like,
Yeah.
what do you mean? They're
Yeah.
like, well,
But they're in a war. That's a little, yeah.
right. But I would say this. I felt safer over there than I feel in certain parts of New York City.
In the South.
Really?
Okay. Now I'll say I feel safe in both places.
Please contextualize.
Yeah. So, like, for example, people are like, you take the subway. I'm like, how many incidents do you think happen a day? Violent incidents happen on the subway in terms of stabbings or shootings? One. How many people take the subway every day? 3 million. Okay.
Only one violent incident
Between 1 to
per
3
day?
stabbing or shooting on the subway.
Who's counting these numbers?
NYPD.
The police?
The NYPD.
Police?
NYPD.
That's-
So Israel, for the most part, at the end of the day, you don't have much of this sort of petty crime. Like, you're not worried about robbery, assault, for the most part, in most parts of Israel, like pickpocketing, any of that sort of thing. So for the most part, unless you're, near the Gaza border, or within Gaza right now, or in there's certain neighborhoods in Jerusalem where there, tensions are high.
Are there cells? Are there, I mean by cells, like Islamic cells of Hamas that are in Israel by any chance, or like? I
mean, there's been individual incidents, but on the whole, safety-wise, for the most part, in the in sort of the central part of Israel, unless for some reason Hamas has found more rockets to shoot off from Gaza, which they were doing earlier in the war, etc. Not much of that today. The incidents are very far and few between.
Are any of those rockets landing, or how effective is the Iron Dome?
So Israel has 3 anti-missile systems. There's Iron Dome for sort of within 40 miles.
Right.
Then they have an Arrow system, and they have Patriot system. They have multiple levels of systems.
So nothing's getting in there.
90-something% are being shot down. I mean, for example, you saw in the recent exchange with the Iranians, 99% were shot. Now, obviously, when you shoot down a missile, parts will fall down, and somebody was injured by that. But in terms of actually hitting their target,
how much? So, I want to talk about the Iranian thing for a second. Iran said, "Hey, we're going to do this attack tomorrow or the next day."
Yeah.
And it wasn't necessarily a surprise attack.
Right.
Do you think that helped Iran/US to be able to shoot down all those missiles? Or do you think that the protection systems would have been able to handle that without even knowing it was coming?
So let's back up here. What happened, right? A couple top Iranian military leaders were conducting a secret meeting, or a meeting they thought was secret, in a diplomatic complex in Syria. The Israelis decided these are high-level enough targets, we should hit them.
Who were theoretically responsible for organizing the Hamas attack on October 7th.
And planning future attacks.
Right.
And organizing, the Hezbollah group in Lebanon.
Right.
And organizing Islamic Jihad. Ultimately, Iran across the region has what's called proxies. So they have multiple groups across the region pushing their agenda. The Israelis go after that. Now, they haven't officially taken responsibility, but nobody else did it.
Right.
So Iran says, we got to get you back. We need revenge for taking out our top leaders. And so this dance was happening for a couple of weeks. Don't make us do it. We're going to do it. What are we going to do? And ultimately, Iran decided to go ahead with it. And they did signal that they were doing this. I think everyone was shocked by the scale in which they did it, because Israel took out,
it was several hundred drones.
Several hundred drones and missiles.
How much did that cost?
The Iranian government?
Yeah.
It's hard to say. I imagine the number is not insignificant. I don't know. Estimates between tens of millions to hundreds of millions, right? That it would cost them. I don't know how much the Iranians are paying per drone these days, but ultimately they signaled to everyone, we're going to do this, and they announced it in advance. Part of that is a scare tactic, a psychological warfare. Israelis cower in fear on this Saturday night. We're about to launch a whole bunch of stuff your way. Also, some of these drones would take 8 hours to get to Israel.
Yeah.
Now, I think some people argue that Iran just did it for show, and they knew everything was going to get shut down.
Right. Which
I would find it
think.
hard to believe the Iranians would spend that much money, send that many, to be like, oh yeah, we totally didn't intend for any of our several hundred missiles and drones to hit.
Wow.
So why wouldn't they do it surprise?
Because I think there's a couple calculations going on in the region right now. At the end of the day, no matter how much everyone hates each other, nobody wants full scale. No one benefits.
If
from
anything
full-scale
would have
war.
hit, it would have been massive retaliation.
Oh, I mean, and by the way, some of those missiles were aimed at the Israeli nuclear base.
Right.
Israel is one of the dozen countries in the world that has nuclear weapons, right? They aimed at Israel. They knew what they were aiming at. Israel's like, oh, you targeted that.
Yeah.
Now Israel's like, we knocked it out. The U.S. knocked it out. The UK was involved. The Saudis were involved. The Jordanians. This is the thing. There's no love lost between Iran and the rest of the region in terms of the way that they impact the region. But at the end of the day, nobody wants full-scale war.
Right.
So Iran, by signaling to the world we're doing this, is sort of like, hey, U.S., we're giving you a heads up on everything.
Yeah.
Definitely. Hey,
it saved their ego a little bit from just having their...
There's a lot that goes on in terms of diplomacy. We only see what's on the surface and what gets leaked out. There's a lot happening behind the scenes. And then that's why like the Qataris play a key role, the Swiss play a key role, because they're the people who talk to everyone and are like, hey, by the way, Iran called, they're going to do X.
Yeah. How much in your position of the behind the scenes back and forth are you privy to?
I'm privy to as much as people were willing to tell me who work in various, who either are actively in government, actively in the media, or formers that have good links into stuff.
Interesting. Yeah, I was going to ask, where do you get your information from?
So there's what's public available, right? So there's news sources that I trust, reporters specifically that I trust. So even if you don't love the organization, I'm like, well, that organization does have one really good reporter who covers XYZ. So there's that. I'm still going to Twitter, X, for like the news feed there. I feel the algorithm is kind of fallen by the wayside, but at the end of the day, I still see a lot of sort of raw information. Now, misinformation, yes, but then I go ahead and try to verify it through other sources. So there's news sources, 1, individuals I know is 2, social media is 3 probably.
But on top of that, you just had a very big interview with the Secretary of State?
Yeah,
Blinken. Yeah. That was really cool. How'd you get that? That's like, he's like top 3. He's like arguably right behind the president and vice president.
Yeah, I mean, he's serving a very key role right now, Blinken, right? He's in the region trying to he's got a very full schedule. He's like, okay, I got to visit Ukraine and figure out what's going on there. I got to deal with the Middle East. So he'll go to the Middle East and meet with the Egyptians, the Israelis, the Palestinians, the Qataris, the Saudis, etc., and keep doing that loop, what they call shuttle diplomacy, where literally you have 5 countries in a day. We talked about that. I was like, you must be exhausted. How do you deal with it? And then he's also got like Mexico.
He's not traveling commercial though.
Wow. No. But I mean, even traveling private on that schedule. Then he's got China to deal with and all of Asia, etc.
So much tension in the world right now.
Yeah.
Feels like it's worse than ever.
But I like to remind folks, if you are a student of history, you understand that like, yes, things feel worse now. Part of the reason is because we have a live feed of everything in our pocket.
True.
And so, if you lived in any era of history and had a live feed of like, oh my God, like, like people in
still
certain...
a net positive in comparison.
I've been watching World War II documentaries. There's some really good like season-long ones on Netflix. We are living in just the most peaceful time ever
in comparison.
Right it's all very small scale. Now listen, like Russia's invaded Ukraine, and if you told Ukrainians like, things are cool, like they tell you otherwise, right? At the end of the day, though, to your point about World War II, there was a point in time when the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor, and the U.S. gets involved. At that juncture in late '41, the war had gone on for 2 years. Hitler had taken over all of Europe.
Yeah,
insane.
He had the UK on the cusp.
And this is millions and millions of people dying. Like the whole world was at war. It was like,
I mean, in the power that he had accumulated, if he doesn't decide to turn on Stalin and invade Russia, taking apart Nazi Germany, I mean, you're talking about decades potentially.
Yeah.
By the way, the Japanese bomb Pearl Harbor. What happens? We declare war on the Japanese.
Right.
Okay. There was a part of us that weren't going to go into Europe.
Yeah, we weren't in. Yeah.
But what happens? The Nazis are allied with Japan, so the Nazis declare war on us.
Right.
And we're like, oh, we got to go to war there too.
These are peaceful times.
Now.
Yeah, now.
By perspective, we've also learned a lesson.
Yeah.
I mean, this has been the most peaceful 80 years. Yes, we had a Cold War. Yes, there have been a lot of regional conflicts. But if you look at, modern human history, especially Europe, most peaceful time Europe has had in 1,000 plus years.
And then even going back, past or prior to modern human history, when you used to have these empires like the Roman, they were just just go kill,
killing, beheading, just
trying to take
rough.
more. We're living
that's
in
some real trauma.
This is world peace.
And we live in a world today where there's about 190 plus recognized countries, and we're in a 50-50 split right now between democracies and authoritarian regimes. The fact that half of humanity lives under, democracy or forms of democracy is pretty remarkable in human history.
Yeah, when it's been a relatively new thing. I don't know if necessarily the United States introduced democracy, but
the Greeks invented it, right?
Okay.
Then it sort of goes away for 1,000 plus years, and the U.S. really brings it large scale. That inspires the French and you sort of see this trickle through the 1800s.
Right. So only within the past 150 years has that really been a thing.
Yeah, where you don't have, like, listen, you still have, like, in a smaller scale form, slavery, and that, like, but, like, in terms of the progress we've made, like, just in the past century and a half, now we went through some so-called growing pains, right? Multiple world wars, genocide, etc.
People trying to fight that.
But ultimately, back to your previous point, the world seems like, the world's an unstable place, and ultimately there's a handful of actors who have a lot of power. And we're at this point where, the UK, the British, basically, ruled the world for a while there, and then it got exhausting and costly, etc. Then you had the Soviets in the US do it for about, 60 years there during the Cold War, the Soviet collapse, Putin sort of living off the fumes of that. Then you sort of had the American unipolar world for a while, and now you got the Chinese saying, hey, what about us?
Yeah.
We're in.
Yeah. They have a lot of people.
Yeah, to go back to your point too, where it's just, social media, it's in people's faces, everywhere. So that may be why it seems like it's worse than ever, but comparatively,
but
we're chilling.
War's been around since the beginning of time.
Yeah.
We've never been able to see it in raw form in our pockets until about 3 years ago. So if you look at, like, Ukraine, Russia, and Israel, Gaza are the first two wars that the majority of humanity is experiencing in their pocket in real time.
In their pocket in real time.
And you're like, oh my God, war is terrible. Yeah, no, war is terrible.
But the key is in real time. Because before social media, let's rewind 20 years ago, it has to be on the front page of every newspaper, the Cold War.
You just hear stories about it.
You're reading it just the day before, but now it's like,
boom.
The rockets are in the air heading from Iran to
Imagine
Israel.
like the Cold War example, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. We are on the precipice of nuclear war.
Yeah.
Like, we're in October of 63. It's Kennedy, or October of 62.
Kids are doing like under their desk
But you're getting the
exercises.
newspaper. And in some cities, you might have an afternoon newspaper.
Right.
And then you got the evening news. It's 15 minutes at that time. Because they actually didn't think, I ran the CBS Evening News. And you look at the history, they're like, we don't think we have enough news to fill a half an hour. Like, again, there was more than enough, but that was the feeling. Imagine, like, getting in real time, like, Kennedy tweeting at Khrushchev, being like, we're not going to remove whatever. Or, Khrushchev saying we're not removing missiles from Cuba. Like, would that have brought us closer to potential nuclear war or, like, farther away? Like, so the fact that we have this real-time situation, I experienced it while I was running Evening at CBS during the Trump era. And he's, like, tweeting at Kim Jong-un and, like, oh, my God, like, you're watching diplomacy happen on your phones. And I would see White House staff, and they're like, I'd be with them, and they're like, "Oh, what did the president just write? Oh, we gotta go deal with this." And so we've only lived in this era of history where we have this real time information, and so I think the jury's out in terms of its impact.
True.
Yeah.
Pretty wild times for sure, but not as wild as they've been, like you're talking about. So I'm feeling blessed. Feeling blessed, and you should feel safe. Yeah, feel safe.
Yeah.
To answer the previous question.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So what are you doing over in Israel?
I'm going out there for a video shoot.
Okay. What are you shooting?
A little fitness shoot. It's with this company called AMP. It's a new device, kind of like a tonal for your home, but it's a new state-of-the-art one that's pretty exciting. So they're bringing me out there. I'm going to demo the product and do a couple videos for them. So
tonal is like the wires on the wall.
It's essentially like an upgraded version of that. So it's a home gym facility that you're able to do, so
and the company is founded in Israel.
Yep.
Dude, Israel has a lot of entrepreneurs.
Yeah, it has a nickname Startup Nation.
Startup Nation?
Startup Nation.
Yeah.
It's interesting. There's the guy who wrote the book actually is a guy named Dan Senor, who actually has a good podcast as well if you're interested in kind of what's going on with the conflict and what's going on there. And what's interesting is they've been trying to figure out like why per capita Israel over-indexes on entrepreneurship.
And banking and just like a lot of really...
Yeah, in particular the high-tech sector. High-tech sector is like remarkable. Like if you look at the Middle East bases for Intel, Microsoft, Google, etc., it's all there. And they looked and they actually found that, they have a civilian military. You're required as an 18-year-old to join the military. And they have found that experience, leading small groups, battalions, etc., has created a culture there where a leadership culture that then when you get out of the military, you're predisposed to really, know how to lead projects, start from scratch. I mean, think about the lessons you learn in the military.
Yeah,
that's so interesting because I'm not sure if Korea is mandated in the same way that
it is.
It is.
Yeah.
And look at Korea. I mean, Koreans are so smart, and their industry with Samsung, LG, POSCO, like all these big multinational conglomerates.
Yeah. South Korea is crushing it.
There's the upside and downside of living in a state of war, right? Like officially, North Korea and South Korea are still at war.
But then you look at North Korea. I think everybody in North Korea has to go into the military too.
It's terrible.
Well, North Korea, I mean, the good percentage of the population is malnourished.
Yeah,
like if
trying to escape.
If they look at data, I mean, the Korean people are all one people.
Right.
The border was drawn with the armistice in '53. Now, North Koreans, on average, are several inches shorter than South Koreans, right? Because of the malnourishment, because of the malnutrition.
Wow.
Terrible.
Because of the way that insane family has run that country going back to Kim Jong-un's grandfather, Kim Il-sung. And so, ultimately, leadership matters, but in the poor case of these poor North Koreans, they didn't have much of a choice in the matter.
Just to think that they were both at the starting line in 1953 or 1950s, and now to see the South Koreans just rise in the global economy. Yeah, they're even taller.
Physically, economically. Another interesting example is if you look at East Germany versus West Germany, right? A line was drawn based on where the Russians got to and where the U.S. got to, right? And West Germany, I mean, now obviously it's one Germany since the early 90s, but ultimately you still have leftover economic issues from their 40 years under communism.
Really?
In East Berlin, eastern part of Germany. They're still catching up to the West.
Wow.
Even as the country's been united for 3 decades.
I also heard that South Korea is suffering from an underpopulation problem. They're not having enough babies.
So they have the lowest fertility rate in the developed world right now.
South Korea is going extinct, unfortunately.
A lot of us are. Japan's going that way. I mean, we did a story when I was at CBS. We visited towns in Japan where the schools are like uninhabited with cobwebs for decades now because nobody's having enough kids. They keep closing schools down. So you have an issue across most of the sort of developed world, Europe, Russia's this case, Italy, Japan, Korea. The U.S. is gradually going that direction. U.S. suffering less so because of the amount of immigration we allow into this country. So countries that are very restrictive in terms of immigration, Japan, etc., are seeing a population decline. In fact, where you're seeing it slowly happen now is China, which they're freaking out about.
Interesting.
China soon enough will no longer be the most populous. Like India surpassed them,
they surpassed them.
But soon they'll go to third place. Nigeria is exploding. So we're going to be in a place where by the end of the century or before, China has less than 1 billion people.
What's Nigeria's population?
I think they're at, you could check me on this, 300 or 400 million, but
massive.
Their fertility rate is still 3+, 4+.
They're above US now?
Potentially right there.
I think we're pretty close.
Wow.
What I was just thinking about, so obviously China has, not obviously, but China has 1.4-ish, maybe high 1.3s.
That's insane.
And
so many people.
India just surpassed them at low 1.4s.
Right.
China had the one-child policy for 20 some odd years, right? But they've since gotten rid of that because of the problem, right?
Yeah.
But
it did permanent damage.
Do you think that there are a lot of Chinese people that would want to immigrate to Japan or Korea for better opportunity because it's so competitive in
China
or
I can't speak specifically. I would want to look further into that in terms of what the Chinese government's allowing, what those governments allow. But you already see, in terms of workers in Japan and Korea, you do see populations coming from Vietnam, from the Philippines. I imagine, to a certain extent from China as well.
You're seeing workers in Korea and Japan. You're seeing people from
the Philippines and Thailand go there.
Okay.
It's in the same way that you see people from Central America come up into the U.S. for certain types of jobs.
Yeah.
And you certainly see it in that part of the world as well. You have these flows. You have it within the EU, and it led to Brexit, right? All the Polish and Eastern European workers coming to the UK,
right?
And then the sort of tensions that get created there, especially in very homogeneous societies. So, for example, here in the U.S., we're an immigrant country, right?
Yeah.
With this whole country exists because people came from other countries. Right. So you come here and you're immediately a Vietnamese American, a Turkish American, a Greek American, no matter where you come from.
Yeah.
That is not the case in Japan. That is not the case in France.
You're not a Chinese Japanese person.
Well, yeah, like you could be there several generations in.
Right.
I mean, I remember I was in like a cab in Berlin, and I was talking to the Turkish driver, and I was talking to him, and he's like, I've been here 4 generations. My great grandfather came here, and they won't call me German here.
Right.
Wow.
But how
Have
different?
you ever been to China?
Yeah, many times. How different is Japanese culture versus Korean culture? Like they're right there next to each other.
Have you been?
I've been to Japan. I haven't been to Korea. My brother just got back and he said it's incredible. But
I've been to all 3, not enough to like fully understand if,
I know Japanese food and Korean food is way different.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about very unique societies, very unique cultures, and I think there's a tendency when you're not from that part of the world to sort of cast people all the same way. But people are very different, in the same way that like every European culture is different. Every Middle Eastern culture is different.
Yeah.
An interesting thing about the Middle East is, the dialects of Arabic are so different that like my family's from Morocco. If you have a Moroccan speaking Arabic in Lebanon or Iraq or Saudi Arabia, someone won't even understand.
Yeah.
It's like speaking, it's like someone from Wales speaking English.
Yeah, that's
talking
wild.
to somebody from Louisiana, right? Very different accents. And so even culturally, food, a lot goes to language, but it's everything.
Yeah.
So same thing, Korea, Japan.
I'm actually 15% Chinese as well.
You're the United Nations as a person.
Pretty much. Yeah. I'm trying to serve world peace
What
through my
else?
DNA.
What else we got?
Everything. As the episodes go along, I'll just let you know what else.
He's gonna drop relevant ethnicities.
But something really powerful that I heard from this Chinese guy I was talking. He's a Chinese billionaire, and he told me it really made me feel very privileged to be an American. And he said Americans don't understand the privilege that they have, and he was saying that in China, given he's a billionaire, no matter how much you work or how successful you become, you could never work towards your freedom, which was really hit me when he said that from this guy that's been so successful. It's like, dude,
the Chinese government has basically come up with a theory that, we will bring you prosperity, but you're not also going to get your political freedom. And, and so they've created this large middle class. And that's the trade-off, right? Stability and some economic wealth to a certain extent, but you're not going to get complete democracy and civil liberties, et cetera. And they've convinced enough people in China that, that's the trade-off you're going to make.
It's an interesting test because it's like, to some extent, it's really worked. I mean, when you're a government and you're responsible for 1.4 billion people, you look at China and then you look at India, which is a democracy, right? And India just has such a huge poverty class and not a very big middle class. And then, of course, there's, the upper class. But, like, it's large in part worked for China.
And China's trying to convince them, and by the way, it's one of the reasons China, Putin, these folks say, listen, look at the mess in America. Look at them, arguing with each other. Look at the instability. And by the way, it's one of the reasons why they try to drive that instability through social media, through bots, through whatever.
Oh, I want to get to that after this.
Is show, hey guys, like any of you here in China who think you want that, it's a mess over there.
Right.
Look at what they're doing to each other.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong, but China's not pure communism anymore, isn't it? It's like slight democracy.
There's no pure communism anymore. The purest form of communism you might still have in this world is Cuba.
Yeah.
And look at their economic state of affairs.
Terrible.
Even the Soviet Union by the 80s was not pure. We've discovered
and partly
that
because they saw America being so successful.
What do you
they're
consider
we got to
China?
catch up.
Like for example, there's a famous quote. I don't know if it's Churchill who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others." Okay. And so if you look
they're all trash, basically.
So basically, like this idea of communism, like anybody who's still advocating communism, like has not read history.
Right.
Now there are elements of socialism, especially if you look at Scandinavia, and elements of the system that Europe has created in terms of healthcare and the net that they've created for people. There are elements there.
It's all some sort of mix,
But I think people have this, tendency, and I hear it from people on social media, like, oh, this is fascism, this is communism. I was like, well, first of all, very different forms of government, very unique, and like I think people tend to cast stuff very, when something feels wrong that the government's doing, they're immediately like, oh, that's fascism, communism. Like technically, no. These are actually very unique systems with unique elements.
Yeah,
but
they call themselves the CPP, right?
China learned the lessons of the Soviet Union very quickly as they saw that collapse, saying we can't go the way of the Soviet Union. We have to embrace elements of capitalism, and you've seen that.
Yeah,
it's the reason why we're talking about ByteDance and we're talking about
what's your take on the U.S. banning TikTok?
So I think it's important to note that this is not the first company that the U.S. government has decided shouldn't be foreign owned.
Which is?
There's been a whole number. There's a whole organization called CFIUS. So I closely covered out of 9/11. There was a company called Dubai Ports World that owned a bunch of the ports. Like a bunch of the ports across the U.S. were actually owned by or being acquired by Dubai Ports World.
Wow.
So at the time, it was post 9/11. How do we feel about like a Middle Eastern Arab company owning these key elements of American infrastructure? And so the government
renationalized it?
Well, the government basically blocked that acquisition.
Okay. And so they were trying to acquire it.
Yeah, so there's an organization called CFIUS, CFIUS, and they will do analyses all the time being like, are we okay with this being owned by a foreign government? Or sorry, by a foreign company.
Do you know what CFIUS stands for?
The Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. Yeah. And so ultimately, CFIUS will go through being like, oh, this, I don't know, example, German company wants to buy 5 nuclear power plants in America. Is that something we feel okay about?
It's honestly a lot deeper than it applies to every foreign investment in the U.S. So Energy X.
Yeah.
We have major investors that are foreign, one from Korea, one from Italy, and we had to go through CFIUS.
Yeah.
We had to basically look at, is it okay for this Korean company to invest into Energy X?
I mean, at the end of the day, the government's job is to ensure, number one, that we're protected in our national security. And they've determined at a very high level at the FBI and national security organizations that they do not trust China's ability to, influence ByteDance. And 170 million, half of America has TikTok. Mm-hmm. The way they compare it is...
And it's all of America's youth.
if
100% of America's youth.
And beyond.
Yeah.
And the way to think about it, as they described it, is think about it at the height of the Cold War, the Russian government, the communist Soviet Union, owning CBS, the New York Times, NBC. I mean, like it's the bygone era, but like owning the most influential media organizations.
And writing all the articles. And writing all the articles, right?
Right. And ensuring that like today on the front page, you're going to get X.
And the majority, I would assume, of the users are at a very impressionable age.
Yep.
So they're super young. And that moment, I don't know if you remember when you were in middle school or high school, it's like those are the downloading times of like you're shaping yourself as an adult, and who you become.
So I had a former CIA director on my podcast last year.
Sorry, what's
former CIA director?
CIA director.
Yeah, Michael Morrell. And he was talking about the meetings he has with the Chinese, his Chinese counterparts. Because at the end of the day, even when they're adversaries, they have, we still have diplomatic relations. At the end of the day, I've heard it described that like China and the U.S. are sort of divorced parents running the world. Mm-hmm. Like we don't like each other, but like we both have major, like we both have major responsibilities, and ultimately stability is important for both of us for our economic success. And he was like, listen, the way the Chinese think about history is they have good millennia and bad millennia. They've been around for 6,000 years. So we talk in the US and the West about good decades, bad decades. They talk about centuries and millennia. So for them, gradually get into TikTok and gradually influence people that like, we might not get you this generation, but by the time they have kids,
exactly,
like they'll totally be, influenced one way or another. So that's how they think about it long term. So I think that like there's a legitimate argument to be made that a highly influential social media platform should not, that if there's legitimate concerns about their ability to influence it, both take our data, but also push out certain misinformation, that TikTok should be here, but maybe it shouldn't be owned by a Chinese company. By the way, the same thing went down with Grindr a few years ago, and nobody blinked an eye. Grindr was owned by, and they were worried because of the way the LGBT community is treated in China, and how they could influence things and how they could use their data. And so the U.S. forced a sale of Grindr. At the time, China didn't care. Wow. But it was a much less influential platform.
So what it is that, the U.S. is trying to force the sale within 6 months, and if they don't...
It's up to a year now.
It's up to a year. Yeah. And if they don't sell it, then the app stores, I think like Apple and Google won't be able to.
They'll ban it from the app stores,
right?
Which means if you have it on your phone, you have it on your phone, but you're not going to get the updates.
You're not going to get the updates.
So, do you think that ByteDance will sell it within the year? Or...
So the Chinese government said absolutely not.
Right,
and
exactly.
the irony is, ByteDance says they have no power over us.
Right.
TikTok, by the way, is owned by ByteDance.
Right.
And it's like half Singaporean, half based in LA. Several Americans sit on the board.
Right.
You know, there's huge non-Chinese ownership of it. But at the end of the day, it's owned by ByteDance. ByteDance controls the algorithm, and the Chinese government has said, nope, we're not selling. Even with a $100 billion valuation or whatever they determined for TikTok. Plus, the algorithm is a secret sauce.
Right.
So there's a lot of talk like, do we sell it without the algorithm? Yeah, that's the addiction, baby. Like that's the drug behind it. So the Chinese government doesn't necessarily want to reveal. I mean, as hard as Meta right now, you know, Mark Zuckerberg's working to replicate.
It's just not as good. Yeah.
And they're gradually getting there. I mean, I feel like Instagram Reels is probably much better than it was a year ago. But at the end of the day, does China want to reveal the secret sauce to the world?
Yeah.
And officially, they say no. I think something to watch. There's multiple lawsuits. TikTok's filed a lawsuit. Influence. I don't think this gets resolved in 25. Probably in 2026. It's going to go to the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, it'll be a case. One side says it's freedom of speech for Americans.
Yep.
The other side says it's national security. It's protecting the country. And 9 Supreme Court justices will have to determine that.
That is where it will go.
Agreed. So what's your take on, obviously you developed Mo News, which is pretty incredible. What's your take on mainstream media right now as a whole? Where do you think it's going? Just what's your opinion on it?
All right, it's big question you asked there.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the mainstream media, you know, we're talking about tens of thousands of sites, right? You know, major networks you've heard of, various websites, etc. I think where the media has gone, well, we have all these new platforms. And it's one of the reasons for our success is we've embraced those new platforms, right? You guys are here on audio, podcasting. Right. That's something that was dismissed in mainstream media for a number of years. It's one of the reasons why the top podcasts out there are like Joe Rogan, Dax Shepard, you know, like
XTRAordinary.
Your download numbers are getting up there.
Let's go.
And finally was belatedly embraced by the mainstream media, which is, you know, when you work in a certain sector where you make your money, you keep doubling down on that. So I was at CBS as of a few years ago, and they're still like, okay, we're selling commercials at $50K a pop on the evening news. Like, let's keep maxing out on that. It's like, well, you know, 99% of our staff is devoted to the old thing. Our audience is getting up there in age. The median consumer of cable news, of CNN, Fox, this is a good pop quiz for you guys. The average viewer of MSNBC, CNN, Fox, ABC, NBC News, how old are they? Median.
65.
I would say a little bit less than that.
73.
No, less.
I would say maybe.
I'm going to say it is 58 years old.
Okay. You were right about 10 years ago. You were right about 3 years ago.
Okay.
Like if you look at who's watching in the evenings on cable news, median age is 70 now, 69 to 70. Half their viewers are over 70.
Wow.
You have a problem as a business if half of your viewers are over 70 and you're not able to replicate that from younger generations. Because you know, we're not going to sit there at night being like, oh, it's on the news tonight at 9 o'clock. And so you got to embrace the new platform. So and in mainstream media, problem one is a business problem, as in news sites have lost their main revenues as well.
Advertising.
25 years ago, the problem with Craigslist, right? Classifieds was like 40 to 50% of ads. So you sold your textbooks, you sold your car, you sold your, home listings. I mean, I don't know if you remember growing up, but you looked in the back of the newspaper and you looked for jobs there too. Well, between LinkedIn and Craigslist, et cetera, so you killed that. Then you got display advertising, which you can't target via media the way you can via Facebook and Google, et cetera. So that killed that part. Then you had the big mistake in media, which for the first 10, 15 years of the internet, you gave it all away for free. So you created a situation in the mind of your consumer that it should all be for free. Even though in print form, I was fully willing to pay for it. But digitally, it's free. Oh, now you put up a paywall and it's like $2 a month? No way, I'm not paying $2 a month.
And everybody feels it, dude. I hate seeing that.
For that? It's like,
it's painful.
Yeah.
Like, even someone's trying to do per story, like 50 cents. 50. If this story is so important, but suddenly you're like, I gotta pay $1 for. No way.
Yeah,
and think about the dumb stuff we spend $1 or 10 or 100 on sometimes, right? And so
I don't want to spend 1 penny on the news.
The problem,
and that's a problem.
That's a problem.
Because the news is core to our society, is core to our information, is core to truth, to core to a democracy. How did
So that's
democracies
where big
prosper?
media has
People have good
failed.
information and make smart decisions in who they elect.
The problem is that I have to pay for every single one individually.
Yeah.
It's like I pay for Wall Street Journal.
Well, Apple has done that with Apple News and to some success.
Yeah.
So some publications have started to be like, all right, I'm willing to give a percentage to Apple to be part of Apple.
They want to be the
News.
Netflix of news.
Correct. I mean, it's what Steve Jobs did for music with iTunes.
Right.
Yep.
After the whole Napster, Kazaa, like craziness of the early 2000s, he's like, it's all going to be under iTunes and you're going to pay 99 cents a song. And guess what? After a couple years of downloading stuff for free, we accepted it. Fine. Because we were so used to paying for music.
And it was
until
easy.
Napster came along.
Easy. He had distribution. Do you know where the word podcast came from?
I don't know offhand.
Do you?
No,
Just found this out the other day.
Okay, that's fair.
Steve Jobs is on the stage giving one of his keynotes, and he goes, most of you probably never heard of podcast. Nobody raised their hand. He goes, so it's iPod and it's broadcast. And you put them together, and it's podcast.
Wow. What a legend.
So
Yep.
Jobs did that too. The thing before Jobs passed away that people were looking at is he was going to fix television with Apple TV. And they haven't quite fixed, Apple TV is sort of here, there, whatever. But that's an issue we face today with I got to pay for Disney Plus.
Yeah.
And
Now
Paramount
it's just
Plus
YouTube
and
TV.
Netflix
Yeah.
and,
It's YouTube
and
TV.
Hulu. And
That's-
YouTube's trying to do that. Google, then that's Google. So I think the issue you have with mainstream media is one, you've lost your revenue model, both subscriptions and advertising. And what happens when you lose most of your revenue model is you start to freak out and experiment in different ways. You start to look to easy solutions. So what are some of those easy solutions? Well, one was Facebook. And for a hot second, Facebook was driving so much traffic. There are websites that lived and died by Facebook. They're called BuzzFeed, Huffington Post.
That's right.
Look at the early 2010s era of news, and some of those sites depended 80-90% of their traffic and revenue were coming via Facebook.
Facebook was the news platform that TikTok kind of is. I would just
evolved.
get my news scrolling through Facebook. Of course,
The newsfeed, they created the newsfeed.
Right, the newsfeed. Yeah, it was the newsfeed.
And then one day they turned it off.
Yeah.
And with it, a lot of revenue to media organizations. And that's why media are approaching stuff gently and, Instagram's owned by Meta. And so what are they going to do? And then what have we seen the last year with Meta? They're like, oh, we'll turn it off on Instagram. News is bad news for us.
Yeah.
None of these guys got into, YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, Instagram. None of them wanted to be news providers. They're there for social purposes, right? Make you happy. You should stay on there and be happy.
True.
What does news do to
you said, though, it's with news, it's rewarded by this sensationalism and by, the fear mongering where, it's like people either love it or hate it, but it's divisive and it draws the attention with the algorithm. So
that gets us to our next part of your question. The mainstream media loses its revenue source. It's looking to these third-party revenue sources. How do we drive traffic? How do we drive audience there? Outrage.
Exactly.
Clickbait. Extreme headlines. I got to make you click to get there, and then I might not fulfill you when you get there, but I'm going to get you again and again until people get so turned off they lose trust that it stops altogether.
Exactly.
And so the state of the mainstream media is it's figuring out how to even remotely replicate the previous world it had for so many years, where it controls stuff. There were only a few sources, and now everybody is a media source. Everybody has a content strategy. And so you're not, at the New York Times, you're not just competing with the Washington Post and CNN and some mainstream media. You're competing with every single podcaster out there, every single newsletter out there, and frankly, some brands that have decided to put out their own content. So it's uber competitive. Revenue's not there yet. You're figuring out subscribers. Are they willing to pay? What is your combination? And in the meantime, how do we continue to drive traffic? So that leads to some desperate decisions and bad decisions on the part of various media outlets. So there's a lot of experimentation going on right now, and hopefully we'll figure it out.
That brings me to my next question. Where do you take Mo News from here? What's next for you?
So one of the first things when I realized this wasn't the thing before the thing, but the thing was I can't just be wedded to Instagram.
Right.
Because to the previous point, what happens when they turn off the faucet one day, right? And ultimately, they are okay with the news there, but they're not elevating the news there. They would much rather elevate other types of content.
Right.
So the first thing was okay, head to podcast, head to newsletter, start to build my audience directly, because we know I got to be platform agnostic, because I'm going to be here for a while, and the platform will change, but the content will not. The overall strategy will not. So I got to get them to places where I can connect with the audience, because one day Instagram, when Instagram had like a couple of their like issues recently, where like we all couldn't access it for a few hours,
couldn't.
Like I was like, what does my 500,000 audience matter? What happens if it goes away forever? I can't communicate with these people again. So growing Mo News most significantly has been about getting onto multiple platforms where I have a more direct relationship with the audience. Then building...
And direct platforms, you consider what? Like, or just mitigate your platforms, because your podcast is distributed through Spotify or YouTube or...
You just got to diversify.
I use a platform called Megaphone, but I control the RSS feed.
Okay.
So I have like, I have data coming from my audience.
I mean, where can people find your podcast? On Megaphone? That's the only place?
No. That's the back end. No, they can find it on Spotify. So I'm on all like 10 of the biggest podcast platforms.
Got
Mo
it.
News, Daily Podcast, Interview Podcast, Apple, Spotify, iHeart, all the various platforms. And then you have, newsletter, which is email list.
Right.
You have that direct relationship. And then, I knew that video, I have to continue to build YouTube, which again, is a third-party platform, but YouTube is the #1 source for news and video in the world. In fact, there's a reason why, as we speak here, TikTok is experimenting with 60-minute videos this week.
Wow.
Because they're trying to compete with YouTube.
They're all trying to compete with each other.
Right. So TikTok started as 15 seconds. And is now offering you an hour to upload.
That's wild.
And then Reels initially started with a certain amount. It's gradually expanded to like a minute and a half, and then IGTV
more and more time.
Yeah.
So now you can upload all forms of video on all these platforms, because they're all competing for your attention and video.
Right.
So Mo News for me is being on the right platforms and growing there, having the direct relationship. We've also built out a subscription premium level, where we've had several thousand people now come in the last year.
Nice.
They get extra content, get deep dives. I answer their questions, more of that direct relationship. We're going to start to build out events.
So how much does that cost?
How much does what cost?
The premium version.
Oh, so premium right now is $70 a year or $7 a month.
So how much do we owe you for this? Do we have to pay you for this hour? How much does that
The bill will come in the mail.
Okay.
Nice. I would be more inclined to pay for, an individual that I can trust versus, New York Times subscription, because...
And I hear that, and part of what I do is bring you original stuff, but I also aggregate stuff for you. So I'll be like, hey, this is what the New York Times is reporting, and this is what the Washington Post is reporting. And I've said to them, people are like, I don't trust them anymore, but I trust it if you read it, you vetted it, you filtered out their bias, and you figured out like, I know this reporter who covers the Pentagon.
I think that's so future. I think that's the future of a lot of different areas. It's like, there's so many different content creators in all fields, but I think we're going to stray towards a level where people are really following curators of everything, because it's like, okay, then you got to get the Apple, and then you got to get this, and you got to get Hulu. But if you have someone that's being your filter and curating, and they can trust you, then you're going to save them time and also that, trust.
And we're finding more and more that brands want to be associated with us and reach our audience. It's a smart, engaged audience. And to the previous point, Secretary of State Blinken, right? The State Department called and said, we want to reach your audience because we know they vote. Like I have a highly engaged audience. They're independent minded. When I do polls, like it's a very interesting mix of people who have voted in recent elections for both Trump and Biden.
Are you doing polls on the election, or what are you doing polls on?
I will poll my audience on a variety of things. On their opinion about Diddy and like the video that came out, but I'll poll them on politics. I'll poll them on consumer habits.
Cool.
And get a pretty good gauge for an audience that is, by the way, we talk median age on cable being in the late 60s. My median age is 33.
Yeah, that's what I would guess.
Half of my audience is under 33.
Nice.
So I'm half the age of the traditional media platforms, which has now led some traditional media. Like I'll get notes from reporters from major networks who are like, "Hey, Mosh, can you post my piece?" I'm like, "You work at a TV channel.
Brother, you're on." That's hilarious.
But they're like, "But I know who like consumes on your platform, and I want to reach them too."
Yeah, that's great.
I want people to actually see it.
The people that matter to me.
Yeah, true.
To see it, right? Because that was one of the remarkable things of working at some of these previous networks. Is I knew that I get the ratings data that 1 million people watch this or 6 million people watch that. My feedback mechanism from my audience was zero. Like I'd go on Twitter and like see 3 tweets, right? Because look at the age of the audience.
Now you're getting hundreds of DMs, I bet.
On every single story, Teague. Yeah. And guess what that lets me do? oh, I got to dive deeper into this story.
Right.
Yeah.
Or on this story, no one cared.
Your feedback loop is incredible.
My feedback loop's incredible. They can ask direct questions. They're asking me questions that as a journalist, I'm like, oh, good point. None of us answered that question.
Right.
Some very basic questions. And I've told people, no stupid questions, right? Like, you're a busy person. You're a serious person. I know that you're busy with your kids and your family and your work and whatnot. I'm happy to answer questions that we may have learned in 8th grade, but have since forgotten about the Supreme Court or about our government. I'm not here to judge you. And frankly, I'm here to give you that backup. So when you see that main headline on Iran or the main headline on Congress, you're not coming in the middle of the movie. Like, let me remind you who these characters are.
I feel like we could talk for hours. You brought up Iran. Big news today
Right.
on Iran.
The president's dead.
Yeah, the president's dead.
Wow. Is he really though?
Yes.
I don't know what that means.
You bring up a good point. By the way, we're getting a rap signal.
We are.
Hold on, I got one more question.
But let me just note that.
Yeah.
The fact that the Iranian government is admitting that he's dead.
Yeah.
But I know that you want to throw your hands up there. He has no shortage of enemies.
Right.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they're very quick in Iran to blame other people in other countries.
Yeah.
This was an accident.
Specifically Israel and the U.S. on everything bad that happens there. They're legit saying, they're not even blaming the outside.
Right.
They're they made, this sort
of... It took them 12 hours to find the helicopter that crashed.
Which, by the way, speaks to the incompetence of the Iranian government.
Right.
They needed Turkish drone operators to find it.
Yeah.
So we sit here and oh my God.
I'm not too familiar with
those Iranians, be scared of them. They're running 70s era helicopters. They got 40% inflation. It's an incompetent theocracy. The people hate the government. They just went through a year and a half of protests where they had to literally murder people in the street and imprison tens of thousands to cut down those protests.
Wow.
And that was just women saying, I want to be able to show my hair in public, right? You have a major problem in that country.
People
and they know they have a
that.
problem.
That was incredible. The Mosheh Amani, just a couple years ago.
The Mosheh Amani protests, we thought at one point might break down the government, might finally break down that regime. They survived. But they have a major problem there. And at the end of the day, the president's dead, but the supreme leader runs the country. It's one of the only countries in the world where the president doesn't actually run the country. He doesn't have control over the military.
He's pretty old,
though.
It's
the supreme leader. 85.
85.
But back to your conspiracy theory. Who is up to replace the supreme leader? Right, you see the president.
And then his son.
And the son of the supreme leader.
There you go. Maybe it's just his time to take over.
So, there's no shortage of enemies that Raisi had. But I would always just chalk it up to pure incompetence. This is Kobe Bryant. They flew a helicopter in a bad weather.
Yeah.
Terrible.
And it's an old helicopter.
I'm there with you.
And they didn't even put a locator, a transponder on it.
Yeah.
So I think there could be some internal action happening there. But for the most part, at the end of the day, talking to some folks in Iran who follow me through VPNs, they said, bring in the new guy, same as the old guy.
Yeah.
Not much hope for anything.
I heard from a close source that back in the day, Michael Jackson wasn't dead either.
Tupac's still alive.
Just throwing that in there.
Elvis still alive. JFK Jr. still alive.
But,
Mosh.
One other question.
One more question. Okay.
Final question.
We could talk for it. You have to come back on the podcast.
Come back for part 2.
Yeah, we could talk for hours.
I've always wondered about this. Now, speaking to the one and only Mosh, journalism.
Yes.
When a journalist says off the record,
that's a great question.
What are the rules behind that?
Okay, I like this question, and I want this. We should cut this as a reel. Okay. Here are the levels of reporting and sourcing that you do as a journalist.
Okay.
Number 1, off the record, as far as I'm concerned, means you can speak openly to me, and I can't use any of it. Now, we have the conversation, and at the end of the off-the-record conversation, I might say, hey, listen, the story you told me about X, can I use that? Either with your name or not with your name attached? Which brings us to level 2.
So you can go back on the record.
On background.
Okay.
Okay. We're not on the record yet.
Okay.
You're like, Mosh, use it, but don't put my name associated with it. That's on background. So when you read a news story and it says, a senior official close to the president, 3 former officials, 2 officials close to...
That's on background.
That's on background.
Okay.
That means you have given me that piece of information. You don't want your name attached to it.
Okay. Going back to off the record, though, I read or heard somebody say, if I were saying to you and I said off the record, but you didn't agree to it, that it's not off the record.
Listen, every reporter has their own rules. I have a rule that...
So these are all unwritten rules.
You have to be very explicit. If you are talking to a reporter, understand that their business is information.
Right.
And they got to come up with great stories.
They're not loyal to the record.
you have to be like, what do you mean by off the record?
Yeah.
Define that. Because some might define off the record as
I just have to say, he said off the record.
Just not your name. Yeah.
Just not your name. Or they might say, I'm going to use that and try to confirm that story with somebody else.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Off the record meaning don't ever mention that this story stays with you and that's it.
Okay.
So then off the record, then you have on background, various levels of that. Interestingly, on background, you have government officials, including the President of the United States. There's actually a famous example of Vice President Cheney, who said, you can use this as a senior official. And people are like, you're the vice president. But he's like, you're going to quote me as a senior official. And it eventually got revealed through like the Washington Post or something that Cheney was calling reporters as a senior official close to the president.
Which is true.
Technically true, but some journalists felt ethically whatever. And then you have on the record, which is I quote you as Spence, I quote you as Teague on the record. So you have off the record, on background, and then you have on the record. There's also variations of background, deep background. That's like you can use it, but you can't attribute it to me. Go find it somewhere else. And so, but again, reporters have their own definition of this. Like, for example, if alcohol is on the table, I always determine it off the record.
Okay.
But some
that's a nice little
reporters are the opposite, which is
whiskey.
Feed you with that whiskey. So you,
and then we're on the record because no
we're
one's going to
back on the
remember
record because you don't know what you're saying anymore. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Off the record.
But
and then what kind of penalties or complications or repercussions if you just throw that record
These
back
are
on the
all
record?
unwritten rules, right?
So ultimately, some organizations, major news organizations, mainstream media, might have rules around that. And ultimately, if you as a reporter, depending on your seniority level, break that and the source then calls your editor or your boss, you might lose your job.
But are there any legal implications?
No, legal is libel and defamation. Right?
Right.
And then that's
I'm never going on the record again.
That's a whole separate conversation. It depends on what you're
I mean, you could
promote.
say like...
But also keep in mind this, as a source, you don't have to answer, it's our job as journalists to get you to answer questions.
So true.
You have to be very disciplined. And my favorite thing as a journalist is covering undisciplined people.
Right.
Including candidates.
Yeah.
Like one of my favorite experiences, I covered the Rudy Giuliani presidential campaign. He ran for president in 2008. He was actually leading.
Wow.
He had 40% in early primary polls against McCain and Romney. McCain would be the nominee in 2008 against Obama. Giuliani, one of the most undisciplined people. And it was so much fun because his people were like, last question, don't answer that. He's like, let me tell you what I really think about it. I love you, man.
That's great. I remember, speaking of that, I remember when I got signed to Interscope Records, they put us through, and I feel like a lot of artists, a lot of people just don't get this.
Yeah.
They put us through severe media training. And that's one of the things that they hammered on to us. They're like, okay, just because you're in an interview speaking to a journalist doesn't mean you have to answer their questions.
Yeah.
And then 2, you don't have to directly answer questions. And 3, whatever you do, try and bring it back around with your answer to something that you want to talk about.
You can literally say whatever you want.
You can literally say whatever you want. But like maybe if your new album's coming out, whatever they talk about, bring it back around.
You know what's interesting about that?
They're trying to get some, clickbait out of you.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that? My new album has a song that says,
Exactly.
And I think as a journalist, I'll tell you, you got to answer all the questions. And I'm also, I launched a consulting business, Mo Digital, where I help brands with a communication strategy. And the first rule is answer the question you wanted to be asked, not the question you were asked.
Yep.
And you have that power. Now, if you do enough of that, you're going to piss off the reporter, and they might write a really negative piece. You have to figure out
balance,
that dance.
Right? It's the weaving.
You have to
back
weave
and forth between what you want, what they want.
But ultimately,
don't let them get you.
But off the record, though.
Off the record, be clear. Off the record means none of this is reportable.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to talk to you about it.
Okay.
So
hey, buddy.
Be very clear. That's why you have Kelly.
This was awesome.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on. We'll do it again.
Yeah, you were definitely extraordinary.
That was probably one of the most fun I've had.